This is Tara Moffett and Jane Gabriele presenting the Special Education Law Update.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Tara Moffett. I'm with Girvin and Ferlazzo law firm in Albany, and I work with 70 plus school districts. And so I'm going to be joined today by the lovely Jane Gabriele from Legal Assistance of Western New York. Jane, do you want to tell us a little bit about your organization, your services as well?
Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're honored you're here. I am Jane Gabriele. I represent families of students with disabilities who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford an attorney. Our services are free, and we are available for people in a 14-county region. So if you have a need in Western New York around special ed, don't hesitate to contact us.
Okay. Both of us are members of the Special Education Task Force in our respective regions. I'm also on the Governing Council for the Special Education Task Force, and very excited that we're at our 23rd annual conference. So without much further ado, we're just going to jump right into the Special Education Law Update. I'm going to begin the screen share, so hopefully you'll be able to observe the PowerPoint on the screen as we go through, and I will dive right in, making sure that I have turned on. Okay. All right. So jumping right in, I'm just going to give you a couple of updates of key things that have developed over the course of this year, just to kind of keep you up to speed. I will note that in the PowerPoint, each of the items that have a hyperlink behind them to just take you right to the document, you will have access to the PowerPoints. I'm not sure if you have it already or if it will be something that will be provided after the fact, but that way, so you don't have to try to write it all down and figure out how to come back to it. So let me start right in with the DS v. Trumbull Board of Education case. BOE stands for Board of Ed. And it basically is a case out of the Second Circuit, which is in New York, the highest circuit court of appeals, and it is second only to the United States Supreme Court. So basically when they issue a decision, we care a lot. The Second Circuit had an interesting case out of January of 2021, which really dealt with a couple of interesting issues, but what kind of came out of it was there were a couple of key points. One is that parents, one of the decisions of the court is that parents can't seek an IEE if they disagree with an FBA BIP unless it is part of a comprehensive evaluation. So if as part of an initial evaluation, a district included a functional behavioral assessment and evaluation, parents are free to disagree with that, and they would be eligible to request an IEE, but a standalone FBA BIP, according to the court, would not be something that would be subject to a publicly funded IEE because they deem that it's not part of a comprehensive evaluation. They also identified that a 2-year statute of limitation does not apply, which had been typically something that many courts had interpreted, which is generally the statute of limitations for court matters involving IDEA claims will be a 2-year time frame, but they said that 2-year time frame does not apply to an IEE request, and since you basically do a re-evaluation, which is the full-scale comprehensive eval every 3 years, that technically means that people may have up to 3 years to challenge an evaluation. That presents a couple of challenges in terms of timing and when people will request that. And that's something that, brought about a lot of questions to the field, which is why the state education department issued a guidance on the Second Circuit decision in Trumbull. I've included the link, and I would encourage you to take a look at that for both as a parent or as a district representative perspective, because there are some changes that may have some impact in terms of timing, due process, as well as decisions about when and under which circumstances decisions should be made about updating evaluations. And that was one of the other morals of the court, is that it said, if you feel like you should have had more information, you could always do another update. You don't have to wait for every 3 years. You could evaluate more frequently. During the pandemic, we've had a lot of different things that have had to, be addressed differently. One of which includes English language learner supports and services. There has been multiple guidance issued by, both the state and the federal departments of education. The most recent being from the Federal Department of Education, and New York State usually just references see theirs. And so just be aware that we do still have obligations to provide ENL or ELL services to students who are English language learners or English as a new language supports and services, although they accept and allow that there may be some modification to that process as a result of COVID and the possibility that such services are being delivered remotely. Lots of stuff on that topic, but I'm not going to dive in because we're going to stay on time and on track. Immunization mandate enforcement. This is something that, because a lot of students, have attended remotely or either by choice or, by default, because the district either was maintaining a hybrid or a remote only schedule, the Department of Health has allowed that parents who ordinarily would have had to have made sure that students had their immunizations all up to date were kind of allowed to continue to attend remote only, even if they did not have their immunizations current and up to date. They've extended it, and they are basically extending it one more time to close out the end of the school year, which means, and this is what's relevant to parents and districts, and that next year in the fall, we may have a lot of kids who may not be up to speed on current immunizations, and parents and students that may be fighting to get in to get those slots so that they can get those updates in immunization. So if your clientele have not done the immunizations last year, you might encourage them to do so now this year so that they're not in the backlog of people trying to get that up to speed before the start of next school year. But this has been like an ongoing issue all year. By the way, the mandated immunizations at this point do not include COVID vaccination requirements. It is just the standard immunization mandates. And so that's where we're at on that point. Just a couple of things that the state really drew our attention to, and as we survived last year in the spring, everything was new and shiny, and we were just trying to figure out how to keep our heads above water. At this point, we're really trying to go a little bit further and recognize that many experiences have been lost or deferred, and we're really trying to make sure that we're supporting the students and helping them, find this to be a celebratory time for them, even though we may be doing things a little bit differently. The Department of Health actually just issued guidance last week on certain permissive options for events and activities. They've issued new graduation options and guidance, as well as options for dances and other special events. I did not include that link, but I can certainly provide the document following the presentation. And that basically just kind of adjusts some of the options and to allow for certain in-person celebrations and events under this, of course, current health and safety guidelines. But generally speaking, they're also encouraging districts and families to be aware that, this is not a typical year. And so to be extra mindful of both our graduating and exiting seniors, but also to think about certain things that may fall between the cracks if you are remote, or are you not having the same level of in-person supports that you might otherwise have. So making sure that financial aid forms and other, communications related to college and post-high school planning are still being done, and making sure that, we've considered and addressed student needs. I know last year we had a number of kids who were getting individual graduation ceremonies as a means of still affording them that ceremonial experience, even though it may not have been in the typical crowd with everybody shouting woohoo and wearing signs. But nonetheless, we will still do everything we can to make sure all of our students have a good year. As we have continued to adapt this year based on certain hybrid and remote schedules, they have continued to adapt the mandates and requirements to allow that students will be able to complete the necessary components of their education in order to earn the credentials and requirements to satisfy course and curriculum obligations. This year, they have adapted the 1,200-minute science laboratory requirement, essentially because they would not be able to guarantee that every single person would be able to get all 1,200 minutes between remote, hybrid, and others. Although many districts did convert to using some online labs and other resources, they've accepted and adapted that you will not have to have that 1,200 minute in order to be, quote, eligible to sit for the Regents, which has a slightly different connotation this year, and I will touch upon that in another slide. But generally speaking, getting the required lab minutes for science has always been a challenge. This year, we have a little more flexibility. What is important to note is that it does not allow districts to free fall and say, hey, we don't need to do labs. You still have to provide, commensurate supports and services consistent with what the students would need to learn in order to do the 1,200 minutes, but they are not going to hold you for a minute-to-minute requirement on that. Which brings us to the question of Regents exams and what's going on. We have a couple of different things that have happened this year. Last year, all Regents and examinations were canceled, as were the requirement to submit homeschooling annual assessment. This year, we've got things that have kind of adjusted, including the parental right to decline examination waivers. Examination waivers is a way that the state came up with to allow for the fact that kids should not be prevented from earning credits or a diploma simply because Regents examinations were not going to be held. So what they did was, they can't say, hey, everyone gets 100, but what they did do is say, we will grant you an exemption. And with that exemption, you will then be eligible to qualify for a Regent or for your diplomas, including Regents diplomas, even though you have not sat for that examination. The exemption is applicable to anyone who is eligible to potentially sit for that exam were it to be offered. And so that means kids who were in the class, kids who have previously completed the class, kids who are currently working towards that completion this year, and if Regents exams were held, would be eligible to sit for that. There are 4 Regents exams that will be offered this June. They are the only exams that will be offered this June, and that is a little bit different. So for all of the other exams that otherwise would have culminated at the end of this year, those will be exemption options for students. Keep in mind that there is a provision that a parent may reject or decline an exemption option on behalf of their child. So for example, if we have students who are, still in 7th, 8th, 9th, or 10th, or 11th, or even 12th grade, the parents could decline the exemption and therefore still require that the student earn the credit and either satisfy the obligation or complete and pass the Regents examination or the exiting exam if and when it is offered. However, if declined, that exemption goes away for that particular examination or option. Keep in mind that the exemption should not necessarily be used as a means of exiting students early who otherwise would not have completed their education process. But generally speaking, we have a number of students who might have, potentially been only focusing on something that may have ended up with a local diploma, but because of exemption options, may at this point be potentially eligible for a higher diploma, a Regents diploma, because they don't have that requirement to sit for those examinations. So we're encouraging all districts and parents to look carefully to determine what is the appropriate credential for a student and whether or not that exemption option may allow for a higher graduation credential. On the flip side, it also cannot be used to exit a student, and that's why parents have the right to decline that option. But remember, once declined, the student then has to either meet the requirement for the exam, whether it's a low pass option, which is between 50 to a 50, 55 to 65, or 55 to a 62, which is the first appealable score. Or we have the compensatory options. There are many different ways that we can get you to graduation credentials, but those options become your only option if you have declined an examination waiver exemption. There are the different documents as well as guidance memos all included in the links. So speaking of Regents exams, let me just touch upon what those 4 exams are. This year, we are offering only Algebra 1, Earth Science, written test only, not the lab component, English Language Arts, and Living Environment. Those are the only 4 Regents that are offered in June. There will be no Regents offered in August. So one of the current questions people are asking is, well, what if the student is sick that day? What if they can't take that exam? What happens? They will be eligible for the exemption if they're unable to, attend or participate. Or if they are eligible in future years, they can still sit for the exam. Important to note when it comes to the exemption waiver is that you are eligible for that exemption as long as you are still a student, as long as it has not been declined. So if you were eligible because you could have taken the exam and sat for it this year, but then next year you decide to give the old college try and sit for the Regents exam if it's offered in the future, you still have the choice of whichever result will be better for you as a graduating exiting student, whether it's the exemption or the actual score you achieve. So helpful and interesting, and all of the specifics which are laid out in the frequently asked questions that was issued by the state education department in response to this whole what the heck do we do with our regions and waivers. They did a lot of Q&A, and I think that it's helpful. This is a very short nutshell version of what's relevant, but I would certainly defer you to that document. And then if there are other questions or concerns, direct them to the district's guidance counseling office to get some additional assistance, or certainly talk to advocates or attorneys in the area, or certainly members of the special ed task force who may be able to answer that question for you. Last but certainly not least, the state education department encourages districts to consider the use of student teachers as a means of filling some of the shortfalls in terms of both the ability to provide as many services as we may have liked to do this year, with sometimes our scaled down staffing and our greater degree of spacing between students that may have resulted in smaller classes and therefore a higher demand for staff. Student teachers have been one way districts have tried to fill in those gaps. We may see more of this happening as we go forward into the next year, but that's just one way that districts can try to continue to provide students who have additional needs that level of service and support, in recognition of the fact that we do have significant limitations in terms of what's available because of the amount of spacing that has been required year to date. Learning in masked environments has definitely been a learning curve for many of us, particularly those who work with students with significant disabilities. Sometimes the ability to understand, comply, and tolerate masks has been a challenge. There is a requirement that districts be mindful and consider whether or not a student is able to comply with that mask requirement on the basis of disability. If not, districts should have, or probably have already, incorporated that option or waiver into 504 plans or IEPs. We do recommend that it be included in those documents just to eliminate issues. I've had, a number of questions or issues raised by transportation that, at school we're fine with accepting that there may be certain students who can't wear masks, but we've had some pushback from transportation over the course of the year. But again, a mask waiver is a mask waiver, and it applies in all environments unless specifically limited. And so we do provide that. We also have encouraged a lot of training and mask understanding and mask training for districts and staff. Transportation, again, we're kind of at the end of the year, so some of these issues, which were much more hot button issues in the fall, have sort of tapered off. But as we have gotten to the point where more and more districts are in-person and in-person learning, we have resolved many of those. But keep in mind that even if a public school district is on a hybrid or remote schedule, if a student is placed by the CSE or by the district at an out-of-district playground, placement, such as a BOCES or a private approved school that is open and operational, if transportation is required to get to and from that program, then transportation is still the obligation of the district, as it is also for students who are homeless, even if the district was not otherwise operating transportation because they are remote or hybrid in a walk zone only. In the event that you need to get a student who's homeless to and from school, that is your obligation. And there's a memo that was put out by the state in order to kind of ensure that there was clarity that even if you're not open and operational for transportation for all students, you must be for students that go out of district at the district's discretion. Okay, so now we're going to get into the meat and potatoes, and I promise this is not going to be the Altera show, but because a lot of those were sort of education updates, Jane and I decided I would kind of run through them. So we're going to kind of jump right into sort of the fray of what were some of the big issues that have come up in the course of this year, and how have we dealt with, survived, and what advice do we have from experiencing things in the trenches. So one of the biggest issues, and Jane, I'll just sort of run through and you can chime in as you have any quick input here. One of the biggest issues that districts struggled with the issue of parent choice in terms of attending in person and remote. I would say, and again, it's regional across the state. There are many areas of the state where they were able to offer in-person or a hybrid model that included at least some degree of in-person services. And we had a lot of parents who, because of hesitance, caution, concerns, health issues, or et cetera, were not comfortable with sending their students to school. They may have been learning remotely, and that may or may not have been a successful, model. We had that situation. We do not yet know whether or not remote will continue as an option going forward. We are still waiting for that guidance from the state education department. But because of parent choice, as well as our options of hybrid versus remote, we've had a lot of things that had to change: manner, format, location, staffing, challenges in terms of, staying within, from a district's perspective, the contractual requirements. There were a lot of amendments and requirements added to try to adapt, because we didn't frankly have agreements or positions in place to address remote instruction or partial remote and partial in-person instruction. Districts got to learn a new word, asynchronous instruction. Parents became familiar with it. Sometimes they loved it, sometimes they hated it. But we have continued to adapt to different ways of meeting our obligations to fulfilling IEPs through combinations of supports, which may not always be the traditional teacher in front of student in a live interactive session. There has been some inconsistent guidance that has sort of come out of the state, interpreting whether or not the federal guidance has or hasn't changed its expectation. I think generally speaking, most educators and attorneys have accepted that, the obligation to provide a FAPE never changed, and it has always been there, and it continues to be there. And that, we always have to ensure that students are able to make progress in order to move forward, in order to be deemed appropriate for that program. Jane, did you have anything else you wanted to touch base on?
I think we're pretty much going to cover a lot of what you have listed there in our upcoming questions.
Okay. This next slide is literally just a list of the updated guidance documents, all of which are also encapsulated later in the slide. So this is just kind of what updated guidance did we have available to us. And here we get into understanding some of our different challenges. So first off is synchronous versus asynchronous learning and instruction. And since I've been talking so much, I'm going to kick this one over to Jane. Why don't you walk us through that, and then I will chime in.
Certainly. So at the beginning of pandemic, all the way back to last March, we had a lot of parents that were very confused about what was meant by asynchronous instruction. And, we were all thrust into this, and Lord knows the schools were very challenged in their own opportunities to be able to deliver instruction in a new way that they were not familiar with. But the expectation was that whichever was in use on that particular day, synchronous or asynchronous, that it would contribute towards the FAPE standard. Free appropriate public education will be delivered. Asynchronous learning was a concern to our families, because essentially it was putting them in a position where they were having to make certain that their students that were under their own roof were following through with the instructions that had been delivered by a teacher. And sometimes that posed a lot of challenges for our families, especially if they didn't understand what asynchronous meant. We had a lot of phone calls back and forth with schools on that issue. But the options that were being provided to the teachers were, you can be you can through the internet, you can be face-to-face with the students, or you can provide them with a packet, and this packet needs to be completed by such and such a day, and then submitted back to us. The idea of asynchronous learning is that it is supposed to be as meaningful and relevant as if the instruction were being delivered by the teacher. Often difficult. There's been flip classrooms for a very long time, where there are entire districts that base their model upon having the teacher record their lesson. The kids watch that in the evening for homework, and then the next day when they report to school, it's the teacher going over what was learned by the student in the previous evening. And so there was a lot of that being carried over into the way that we were instructing students. boots on the ground during pandemic. Can we move on to the next slide?
Yes, indeed. So these were just some additional options in terms of what we saw. And Jane, I don't know if you thought were consistent with what you saw in your areas, because again, Jane and I are from two different regions, and I think that there's definitely been a lot of different regional approaches as to what was available, how things were addressed, both synchronous and asynchronous in terms of instruction. So I will let you walk through and then we'll chime in.
Sure. So when teachers were trying to figure out how to progress through this, and they were under a lot of pressure to figure out a lot of things in a very short period of time, the guidance that we were receiving from state ed was that they could encourage the students to watch a program. They could listen to a recording, follow directions. There were instructional passages that would have a writing requirement. They could do a group activity or do something independently, but then it was recorded. And then the teacher was able to look in on what the student had been up to. It was important to our special needs students that all of the asynchronous learning be progress monitored to make certain that it was contributing to meeting the student's goals, as well as providing the student a free, appropriate public education. And of course, it all got more difficult when initially when everybody was remote, and then when parent option came in and we had to figure out, whether or not, how are we going to roll forward? For example, my son teaches chemistry and he reports to a classroom every day, and he has the camera in front of him and he has students in front of him. So he's delivering instruction to the students, both that are sitting in the classroom with him and also the ones that have remained remote. But he also has the option, for example, most of the districts in my area used Wednesdays as office hours, right? So there was not specific instruction being delivered directly to a student at that time. And we can talk about that a little bit more later and what that means with regard to the number of minutes being delivered and how that played into our ability to deliver a FAPE.
I think that one of the things we learned the most of is that we have had to become very familiar with technology. All of us had certain levels of comfort. We pushed a lot of people out of their comfort zone. We had a lot of need for education, but one of the biggest challenges in terms of making some of that remote and asynchronous learning effective was making sure that students as well as staff had the knowledge, the understanding, and the access to both a device for learning as well as the necessary technology and internet access. And again, I'll give examples from within our certain region. We had a lot of, I represent like 70 different districts. So, I'm talking up to the Plattsburgh City School District down to Westchester County, all throughout the Adirondacks, the Catskills. So you've got different areas which are far more rural, where internet may be more unpredictable, and districts, had to kind of come up with creative solutions to both ensure that students had access to the necessary materials, but also recognize that not every family had good, consistent, reliable Wi-Fi. So we had some districts that had the Wi-Fi bus that would kind of go around at scheduled times, so that families could, kind of come within a zone and be able to download and access materials, get the Wi-Fi, get the remote lessons downloaded so that the students would then have them to be available to view if they were doing the asynchronous learning, or to download or upload assignments in order to turn them in. We had a lot of, public locations where, the district actually, I know several districts just expanded its Wi-Fi coverage to include out in the parking lot, so parents could drive by, use the code, and pop in and download assignments and things after hours, as long as they were within the parking lot zone of the school district. There were lots of different ways that we did, try to bridge the gap, and then obviously making sure that if you could not provide it or make sure it was available in a digital type format, to make sure that the material was still available to students in hard copy. And that meant, potentially having bus driving around delivering packets of materials, having parent pickup. Oftentimes we tied the material pickup and delivery to food services to make it easy, so that when families were coming to get foods or lunches. They would also pick up the materials. Those were just certain things from the district perspective. Jane, do you want to weigh in on some of the experiences of your clients with respect to technology and access?
This was a huge mess in our area. We had a lot of challenges, especially initially. And in fact, our largest districts didn't have enough devices to provide to thousands and thousands of students. So pretty much it depended on, they just made a judgment call that they were going to give devices to the high school kids until they didn't have any more. And then everybody else, if you had one in your home or you could access your education through your phone, then you got an education. There was a lot of running around trying to provide paper dittos and things in order for students to be able to have some access to their education initially when the pandemic hit. As far as Wi-Fi access, our library actually had like 400 devices that you could check out for a 2-week period. And people were running around trying to lay their hands on Wi-Fi devices that they could plug in. They often failed. That continues to be a problem in our area where students struggle to have access to their education because the Wi-Fi constantly drops because they happen to be in a part of the city or the county where the signal is simply not strong enough to sustain a day's worth of connection to the internet. So kids go in and out a lot. And the ability of our districts to follow through with some of the things, these very creative and interesting ways that Wi-Fi has been delivered, overwhelmed some of our districts. So access to an education could sometimes be a matter of socioeconomics and where you happen to be living at that moment, and really did have a tremendous impact on some of our districts with regard to our ability to deliver FAPE to students.
And we will be touching upon what we do in the event that certain services or progress was not made in our comp ed discussion, which is coming up. So we're presenting the basic info, but we are still coming back. Don't worry, we aren't leaving you hanging.
Great. And
okay, so one of the biggest,
overcome that in the fall. We got much closer to being able to deliver that over the course of this year, but for many students, it's been very challenging.
Exactly. And speaking of challenging, it has been difficult for a lot of students to remain engaged with remote learning. And particularly, I mean, we know that with students with disabilities, oftentimes that in-person, personal touch, but of course at an appropriate safe distance and with barriers, etc., is always important. When kids were learning remotely, there were, both the technology issues and then the understanding of the student that, I don't have a teacher directly in front of me. I have a teacher on the other side of the screen in front of me. And for younger students, that was a very difficult thing to adapt to. For older students, they may have been a little more familiar with the format. And for brand new students, they don't know any different because they've never had a teacher in front of them. So we had varying learning curves. We also had varying parent learning curves. Sometimes parents, were expected to assist students and, with the log on, download, access. And, we had, for my districts, a lot of them did like parent academy trainings, and they had PowerPoints and step-by-step lessons as to how to access, download with pictures, step-by-step guides to try to bridge that gap. And they also offered, parent training, Zoom meetings and other things to sort of walk them through. But, one of the things Jane and I talked about was not every parent is that tech savvy or even has the ability to understand how to get on to attend those Zoom sessions and trainings. So we also talked about how, some districts had a Wi-Fi, lo-fi packet where you could, get the packet that walks you through step-by-step because you may not be able to access the Zoom or Google Meets where you could actually see how to do that. Then the bigger issue was also student engagement. And that has been, excessive absenteeism, not logging on, and trying to figure out our best strategies and approaches to get them back on and to get them back engaged in the process. So there were, we have a lot of different strategies. I think one of the most important is to acknowledge that there are barriers that, pretending that this is not, this is, business as usual is not particularly helpful. We have to recognize and eliminate the easy things, the technical barriers, the access with devices. Oftentimes parents were asked if they had a device in the house that their student could use, but they weren't asked the question of, are there enough devices that if you have more than one student who may need to be logging on, that you have enough device or space to allow more than one person to be acting simultaneously, because that was a big issue with scheduling, especially middle and high school and elementary school, and that may have directed certain districts towards more packet-based models for the younger students as opposed to middle and high school, where that engagement and interaction piece can be critical. It's not to say that it's not critical at the elementary level, but that because of a device shortage in certain districts, that was a big issue. And trying to figure out ways that are helpful to really get a student to engage and to be part of the discussion and process. There were lots of different strategies, a lot of different recommendations have been made. And these are kind of just lists of some of the most effective, in trying to figure out how do we ensure that students are getting the supports they need. And often it involved bringing in community partners. It wasn't just enough to say, Mom and Dad, this is all on you. You need to make sure that they're online because the parents may have been at work. It doesn't mean that we don't have an expectation that the parents will facilitate and support in some way, but we have had to look to other areas and supports, especially where you have families who, may be part of the essential work staff and, did not have the luxury to be home while their kids were trying to get online and do these supports and services. And trying to figure out how do we get the work back from students who may be able to do the work, but we can't get them to submit it. And these are a number of those challenges. Jane, from your perspective, what were you seeing on your end that worked or didn't work?
So you noticed how many times Tara used the word parent in that conversation that the explanation that she was laying out. A lot of times I will have parents who their child reports to their bedroom for their school day, and that is the expectation is that the parent has sent the child off to school that day, and now they're in their bedroom in front of their screen. And then the parent is in another room doing their work, and nobody is more stunned than our parents to get a call saying, hey, your child hasn't been signing in for school. Meanwhile, the child's in the bedroom checking out the newest YouTube. So we've had a lot of concern about what the parent role is with regard to promoting the ability of their students to not just be in their bedroom, but actually sign on and be recognized as being present. Now, we've also had a lot of technology issues. We presume they're technology issues. There's some challenge around, we have had a lot of parents reporting back, I sat there next to my child, I signed in with them, and then the student was just never let in the room. It's always difficult to assess these things. We're not really sure what is causing the problem. We know that there are sometimes personality issues that get in the way of a student's ability to, they're being recognized as absent by the school, but the parent is saying that they were present and had every intention of participating in the class. But for some reason at the other end, that never happened, and now they're counted as absent. So there's a lot of give and take that has to happen. There's an awful lot of additional responsibilities that we're putting on both teachers and parents to try and promote not just putting the child in front of the screen, but actually getting them to sign in. And then that leads us to the moral. Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. I was going to say, I think the moral of the story that we've come up with is there has to be good communication. Communication of an issue of signing on and being on, communication of problems that are arising during online instruction or remote instruction, and then communication as to work completion and work submission, so that we're working together to try to resolve these issues, because pitting one against the other doesn't necessarily work. And candidly, kids are smart, and if they see mom and dad and school district are kind of at odds with one another, they'll just ride the middle and let everyone else fight it out. We want to make sure that everyone is giving the student the same message. These are your expectations. These are the things that you're wanting to do. I just got a weird message that says kids are waiting to get entered into the waiting room. That just seems funny. It's probably somebody's link name. Anyway, but it just kind of was funny because it sort of aligns to what Jane was just saying. Making sure that we have a system to check for late arrivers that may be coming into a meeting, and all of these different things. And then a number of different strategies that can be effective in terms of, follow up, making connections with kids, trying to engage them. Using your relationships can be one of the most valuable ways to get student engagement, and then really, looking at other options and maybe necessary accommodations to the extent that we are at a point where we cannot get past certain issues. Does doing the same thing and expecting a different result go well? Probably not. And in some cases, that's where we looked at potentially bringing kids back into school, allowing other students other flexibilities and things like that.
And that the communication be contemporaneous. Nothing frustrates my parents like finding out at week 10 that their student hasn't been signing in for the last 10 weeks. We really need to be aware and on top of that as an ongoing matter and not just letting it accumulate. The second half of that, Tara, before we move on real quick, the other issue we've run into quite a bit is around the students signing in, but then not completing the assignments. And I talk to teachers and parents who have kids that sign in and then they don't have their face up on that screen. So they wander off and they make themselves some breakfast and they feed the dog and they've got things going on. So they have technically signed in for the day and are considered present, but they are not actually engaged in the instruction. And we also have a lot of students that will turn off their video, or they'll turn the thing up so that the teacher is looking at the ceiling, or we've had kids Zoom bomb with certain backgrounds. That's very distracting. So another huge problem is, what do we do with the kids who do sign in at some level and are in some way present, but are not completing the work and assignments? And once again, we need to, as Tara pointed out, rule out any barriers, have good communication. All of these things are requiring that the parents be deeply involved. And that whole issue that Tara started out with of remote, in-person, hybrid, that's all playing into decisions that are being made with regard to the student education.
And with the engagement and the student participation, we have, addressed some new attendance issues, because again, we know that students who are not attending, or even with excused absences, if they lose 10% or more of school days, they will have, declining achievement and or may not meet necessary standards. That's in a perfect world where everyone's able to come into school. Now, when you add remote and other elements, we've had, the need to kind of find a way to strike a balance where we want to ensure student, health and safety, and we want to make sure that they're able to, access and benefit from programs. But we also need to recognize that we're kind of under unique circumstances and have some flexibility, some collaboration, and really kind of work with our parents and our community agencies to try to fill these gaps in terms of the connectivity, to try to get our families, to get our students to understand that attendance is essential, and making sure that that message is communicated consistently, and that we do have a means in place, both from the district as well as from the family and from the community, to try to support student attendance regardless of modality of delivery of instruction. The state education department put out a kind of collaboration championship presentation talking about how parents, community agencies, and districts can and should be working together to send the message that attendance and engagement and participation and work performance all are so intricately tied together that we need to keep that in mind. But recognizing that in the event that after you've done everything you can, you still have not resolved it, there are other options and supports, but we want to approach cautiously before jumping to education abuse or neglect issues, because there are some extenuating circumstances. And I would strongly encourage everyone to look very carefully at, have we reviewed the barriers? Have we had a CSE meeting to review and discuss issues with student access, ability, performance, and whether the modality of delivery is effective? And all of that is part of the process.
Right, and we have seen this play out in some unhealthy ways in our district. Our largest district has developed an attendance policy where if a student is not present for 20 consecutive days, they will be moved into, they'll be moved into an unstaffed study hall. And, you know, they're going to go on ahead, and the school has a series of gates that they have to pass through before they can do that. But that's whether you're in kindergarten or whether you're in 12th grade. And then the requirement is that the district is imposing upon the schools that they refer to CPS for that kind of a situation. But I was talking to a parent whose child is deeply autistic, and she was so upset. She was saying, they're threatening to disenroll my child. I haven't signed him in 2 months because his autism is so triggered by being remote. It was the only option that was being offered by the district all the way through until January. So there was no other place for this parent to send this child. And the mother was saying, I can't sign him in because it sets off a bomb in my house, and he's already snapped 3 laptops in half. So as Tara said, we have to be aware and sensitive to some of the underlying causes for the attendance issues, and be addressing that directly with the families to try and figure out how we can best resolve it.
All right, I'm going to just kind of power through very quickly the next few slides, just because they relate to some questions and answer guidance that the federal and the state education department put out, just in terms of some of the big questions about, like, you know, we had IEPs that said you're starting on September 3rd, and then the school district didn't start till September, 28th. And a lot of people were concerned that the IEPs don't align with the actual school year. Again, it matters, the date on the IEP is sort of projected, but regardless, we have to make sure that students are getting the, collective experience of the 180 days, regardless of when it starts and when it ends. Just like last year, many districts ended the school year early because they powered through a continued education through break. The same thing is, it's not the exact date and match up on the calendar, it's a matter of the collective experience of 180 days. But what we also know is, regardless of methodology or approach, whether it's in-person, remote, hybrid, or everything in between, synchronous and asynchronous, the student should still be getting access to their IEP, access to their appropriate services, and be able to demonstrate meaningful progress in order to show that they have access to FAPE. We obviously adapted this year to IEP meetings via remote. Up until this point in time, we had some parents would attend via phone conference. Now I think that remote meetings have actually been, to a fair degree, a success, where we've had, the appropriate access to technology, because it didn't require parents driving. They were able to maybe fit it in during a lunch because they didn't need the, half hour on each end to get to and from the district. So I think that the remote meeting and virtual meetings may be something that will stay. Also, the option of, sending materials electronically via email can also be helpful, as long as parents are interested and have signed on to receive materials that way. We've also been a little flexible, more so at the outset of the year, less so now, with the completion of evaluations within a 60-day timeline, because so many evals were deferred at the end of last year. There was a kind of a backlog. I think now most districts are kind of up to speed on that. But remember, there always is some degree of flexibility where the parents and districts can either agree, we don't need to do the full enchilada re-eval. We might agree just kind of a comprehensive, records review and discussion may be appropriate, and we'll do formal evaluation next year. Those are just sort of different ways that you can get there. But end of the day, you still always need to have what you need to be able to make meaningful decisions, to develop an appropriate IEP that describes the student, and to determine what their needs are so that you can drive the program appropriately. Parents and districts can and have prioritized bringing in students with disabilities for in-person learning. Oftentimes for districts, that was the first population to come back for in-person learning. And then they started adding in, mostly it was our self-contained students. Then it may have been students who were in integrated and co-taught classes. Again, trying to prioritize, because we recognize that they were some of the students most hardest hit by the transition to remote only, because it may not have allowed the level of support that they might otherwise have needed. We still do need to make mask accommodations, which we've kind of touched upon. And then we learned this year that there are ways that you can evaluate kids that may not be in person. We are able to do a lot more virtually through evaluation process, but it's important to note that, most of these standardized evaluation measures are not norm referenced for remote administration. And that has been something that, a lot of our, professional organizations, ASHA, Speech and Language Association, the OTs, the PTA, the Physical Therapists Association, all kind of came together and talked about, are these effective and appropriate delivered remotely? And, I think we came to the conclusion that we can still derive meaning, but it's not, we all acknowledge it's not the same as an in-person evaluation. And so we've kind of adapted to that. That is still something we're going to continue to work on. New York at the outset of the year had a bunch of, flexibilities in terms of reopening. They had a mammoth guidance that was, over 100 pages that we were supposed to read on the 23rd of September after the school year began, and try to get all of these other FAQs incorporated. It was definitely challenging, but what they again reiterated was the importance of instructional experiences being meaningful, including having, actual contact and interaction with certified teachers, supports that were, uniquely designed. You need to individualize, you need to support, you need to differentiate in the same way you would in a classroom, even if you're doing it remote. And that, the content, whether it's delivered hybrid, remote, or asynchronous, was still consistent with what a student would otherwise receive in the classroom. And again, similar to kind of the, options to ensure meaningful instruction, we have a lot of the same strategies of different ways that it can still provide, the comparison of what would otherwise have been provided in person, but, recognizing that we may have some changes in terms of delivery, how you can still make it meaningful and similar to what a student would have had in class. And it did require a lot of education on behalf of districts, of staff, as to how to use, different breakout group options, how to do, communal documents and shared PowerPoint and different, Google Classroom engagement activities, so that everyone can be, working in a group, which is important because of the socialization is always a big issue for kids, especially with the remote only. The next two slides, I'm just going to sort of touch upon that the state finally gave us some flexibility on how we could still meet our obligations to deliver supports and services with kids in a special class and still comply with our distance and safety requirements. And they did agree that you can split a class in two and have the TA on one room and the teacher on the other, and then they can flip back. And that was one critical step to kind of allow us to sort of make more with the same number of staff, because we needed to meet the safety and distancing, but also still recognize the obligation to provide quality instruction. They did a similar thing with integrated co-taught class, allowed that it could be broken in two, even mixed and distribution, and then the teachers, the gen ed and special ed teacher, could each teach that section and then flip over to the other side. As long as both groups got the same level of support from both staff members, it was still technically an integrated co-taught class, although on paper it was kind of a different approach. So those were sort of some of our,
with regard to that particular issue, Tara, I did have one fact pattern that came up in our community that was specifically involving that issue. The district had removed the certified special ed teacher that had worked with a very, very challenged group of kids. It was all remote at that time. And they replaced the special ed teacher with a TA, and that person became the student's teacher. That was not okay. The TA was not being certified. She was not being supervised by a certified special ed teacher. The district had read the guidance to say that for specific periods of time that the TA could be the teacher, and that was simply not the case. So parents needed to be on notice. They all of a sudden had lost their special ed teacher that they were very familiar with. And now there was a TA that had been in that role in the previous year. And now we were having to figure out how to restore that class. So some of this guidance did cause confusion in our districts.
And again, that was, I think that it was a constant challenge for a lot of districts, that in order to provide the spacing distance and making sure that they had the small number of students in classes and that they weren't going over, and still ensure that they had the proper certification. So those flexibilities did allow districts to move forward. And I think that, you know, both the state in their guidance ensured that it was still quality instruction. A TA can work with a group of students, but it should be on repetition and review or reinforcement of concepts, and certainly not primary instruction. And that's always been the standard, and that needed to continue to be the standard. A special ed teacher or a general education teacher can supervise a TA, and they can do so based on that guidance from the other room, as long as they're collaborating and ensuring that there is quality carryover from the instruction to the services. Okay, so now we're going to touch upon what kind of gets to be a hot button issue of the question of in-home services, or, you know, different service timing and strategies. As the pandemic initiated, there were, you know, when we were initially doing a lot of remote instruction, there were many parents that said, I will not send my child in, but they are not benefiting from remote. I want services in the home. And of course, it is a potential part of the continuum. However, it is also, you know, balanced against health and safety, environmental controls. I mean, obviously, a district can't control what goes on, the level of care or the level of mask wearing and the level of compliance with people, you know, traveling in and out of state into those homes. We're out of that control. You know, staff availability, flexibility, and their own health needs about going in and out of a home. Vaccination status, which up until January was, you know, pretty unlikely. And then access to necessary or critical equipment. All of those things had been, you know, challenging factors. And I think that for the majority of districts, they were not in a position until maybe very recently to even contemplate in-home or alternative services. I think many districts did, in lieu of in-home services, had either days where kids came in to get related services, even if they weren't coming in for the in-person instruction, where districts were trying to prioritize that in-person for those more critical areas that did not translate well to distance instruction services, as well as, you know, looking at what is meaningful to the student. But it is important to note that if the parent requests in-home and the district determines that it cannot work, and we also acknowledge that the remote or other method of delivery that is currently in effect is not working, that there may need to be a discussion on compensatory education services, which is definitely one of the things that we, you know, Jane and I spent a lot of time chatting about that yesterday, and I want to make sure that we get to that. So we have, I think it's like 2 slides down. So I'm going to skip right ahead. Just one quick point on homeless youth. Nothing changed regardless of, you know, the closure and or remote or synchronous versus asynchronous. Homeless students still have the same rights and entitlements. And again, if they needed transportation to get to and from, if a district was offering in-person instruction, then they were entitled to that. And also want to remind everyone that homeless students not only have the right to transportation, but also have the right to receive certain extra supports and services, which may include, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hit click, which may include other things like, you know, obviously the lunch program, health services, PPE materials, which they may not be able to come by as easily, as well as, you know, access to technology and other supports. And so, and the last but not least part when it comes to homeless youth is that once they become permanently housed, if fortunately they are able to secure housing as we go forward, they are still eligible to continue and complete out that school year with transportation in that last program, and in certain instances may be eligible for 1 additional year. All right.
We've had a question come in that rather nicely sets up this next slide. Can I read it?
Absolutely. Go forth.
So this person asks, I'm not sure if you're going to touch upon this, but I was wondering to what extent COVID can justify services not being provided as they are written on an IEP. For example, a student receiving a half hour of special class math as opposed to an hour.
Well, I think that kind of dives right into our questions and discussion on compensatory education. And it has been a very challenging year for, you know, trying to figure out how you can effectively deliver what you need to do, but still working within the confines of health and safety. And in some instances, districts did reduce the total number of hours so that they could either run 2 sessions, a morning session and an afternoon session, or they, had remote or hybrid instruction to sort of balance, but in doing so ended up reducing the total number of time. And so the implementation of the IEP as written did not necessarily happen. Now, the ideal circumstance would have been on the additional time that was not provided in person or through remote should have been addressed through asynchronous to make sure that the student is still getting the collective experience. When it comes to comp ed, it's not necessarily a one-to-one entitlement, but it's more like the spirit of, did the student get what they needed? And if not, then the district may be responsible to provide compensatory education services. And you have to review what was the adverse impact of that loss of service on the student. Where did we anticipate they would be? What did we expect? We sort of look at where other kids went as well. And then, looking at the student's own history, and then looking to see what do we think is appropriate to try to remedy and rectify that. It's not automatic that, a student misses a session, because candidly in a regular year, kids may be out, they may be sick, they may have a field trip or something, and they may miss sessions. And you miss a session here or there, that doesn't necessarily preclude your ability to make progress. But if you miss a substantial portion of your program and you are not making that progress, and the student was there and was participating, we don't see any other barrier, then there definitely is that discussion on comp ed and what is appropriate and how do you remedy that.
Right. So I'm going to stick my nose in just for a second, Tara. So if you're ever going to see special ed attorneys come to fisticuffs, it's always over compensatory education. The courts have taken an interesting view of comp ed over time. And it's viewed through sort of 2 filters. One is a minute for minute comparison. So somebody just also sent us a message that I'm going to, a question that is also going to play into this. So I'll get to that in just a second. But if I am able to document on behalf of a parent that the student was obligated through the IEP to receive a special education teacher during a certain period of time, and there simply wasn't one provided, then I, as the attorney, help the family go back and calculate the number of hours and minutes that were missed. And that is the amount of compensatory ed that we would look for on behalf of that student. The courts have upheld that, but they have also upheld a model which we think of that as the quantitative theory, but then there's also the qualitative theory. And the qualitative theory presumes that if the student was able to still show meaningful progress during that time, that the amount of compensatory ed would be regulated based on the need of the student at that moment, rather than the actual number of hours and minutes that were missed. And the question that came into us was, how about the inability to staff one-to-one positions despite best efforts to hire? What are legal implications of that? You want to take that on, Tara?
Yeah, and hiring and securing staff this year has been very difficult. We had a lot of retirements. We had a lot of people who took medical leaves. We had a lot of, people who had, family tragedies and other circumstances that just made it very difficult for securing one-to-one staffing. And again, we would have to look at those issues to determine what was the impact. Was the district able to come up with, in consultation with the parent, maybe a creative way to address that, and the student was still able to access and make progress? And if not, then it's harder to look at adapting and addressing a one-to-one support as opposed to a personal performance.
So
somebody's off mute. If you could please, thank you. But it was also a matter of understanding that, you still have that review and discussion as a committee. And it's, again, trying to figure out what was the impact and what's the appropriate remedy. In some cases, we're looking at compensatory education in the COVID world differently. In the past, it's always, how was it impacted and what's the best remedy? Now, we're not disputing the impact. We understand there were definitely losses that occurred. There were many instances where schools started substantially later, that providers were absent or unavailable for periods of time. So it's not necessarily a question of did they miss something. It's more of a question of how do we remedy that and what is appropriate? Is it a matter of building in more service for this short period of time? Do we carry it over into the summer? Do we put it in or make a bank of hours? And that's really where some of the creative solutions have been, what's the most appropriate manner? That's really where I think a lot of the meat and potatoes of CSE discussions are on, we're not in necessarily dispute over whether or not something did not occur in the manner that we otherwise would have anticipated. The question is what do we do?
And what you just said, Tara, raised a question. Are we legally obligated to inform parents that their child is not receiving a service, either not enough minutes or not at all? So that's a good question for you.
I mean, I think that, when you meet for a CSE, one of the first pieces that you always do is you discuss what did the student receive, any issues and or benefits of that progress and performance. So I think that, in the interest of transparency, if there was an issue, I think you need to acknowledge it and address that issue. Again, it can be mitigated that although this didn't happen, the student did make X, Y, and Z gains, but at the same point in time, you cannot ignore a shortfall of services. You need to address that and determine, did that impact the student? What was the potential loss or the impact of that failure? Or did it really, was it not something that, happened? Because again, all of our services blend together. It's not like you only make progress in speech, just in speech, because the skill is carried out through other areas as well. And so it may not be, exclusive, but we do look to see if something didn't happen. We need to look at what was the progress. Do you see a decline, which obviously is a natural connection to
Tara,
as
a parent attorney, we would want to encourage any member of the committee to be upfront about what they saw with regard to what was happening for that student. So if there literally were services that are not being provided through the IEP, and we've had pretty good luck with that. Most districts encourage their committees to be forthright and honest about what was happening with a student. We had another question come in about the statute of limitations and when families would need to raise combat concerns by. That's very relevant, right? There's a 2-year statute of limitations for any violations of an IEP. I haven't seen anything, Tara, that would modify that. Have you?
No, there is a 2-year statute of limitations, but when it comes to an issue of comp ed, now is the most important time. It's not, saving up and raising an objection 2 years after the fact does nothing for the benefit of the student. So if there is a question or if there is an issue of the need for compensatory education, it should be discussed now, because we don't want students to be further down the road without having resolved that issue. And, the most important time to address a deficit is now. So, yes, you have a 2-year statute of limitation. I would certainly not advise that you sit back and hold on to that grudge and then come back with it at a later point in time. I think that everyone agrees that if there is an issue and a concern about student performance, you need to address it now, and that is the most important time. The only time we really get like a 2 years after the fact.
I was going to say
the only time we really get a 2 year after.
There is some flexibility around when you became aware that there was a violation. If at some point outside the 2-year statute of limitations, you had no reason to know of a violation, but then you became aware, that can also be a consideration in determining when that would be appropriate. And I know, Tara, we wanted to cover our final issue here regarding.
Yep. So I'm just going to, the latest guidance from state ed, I'm just going to skip forward. I mean, end of the day, the only thing you really need to know about comp ed is it's all about data and progress monitoring. And if the student did or didn't make progress, that's going to help guide your discussion most effectively on whether or not comp ed is appropriate. And then it's really more of a creative solution. But most recent guidance, and I just added this the other day, was the question of eligibility and attendance for students who are over age 21 plus. And, the basic concept is, one, it's an option, not a mandate. And I think that this has been a very hot button issue because many folks felt that, it wasn't a typical year, and therefore, because of that, students may be entitled automatically to another year where they could get a more typical experience. That's not per se the standard. The question is, whether or not the students, plans, whether or not the students, implementation of the IEP, whether or not they were meeting their goals happened. And if not, because school didn't start in person for 6 months and are just picked up in June or January, and kids were not able to access that community-based program, that they weren't able to, participate in some of the activities that they otherwise would have done, that's where you start to look at if the result of the loss was that they did not get the quality, they did not make the gains, they did not complete the plan or transition. That's where you really look at the possibility of having a student potentially continue beyond age 21. And again, it's a district decision. It is something that they have to be conscientious of, because one of the biggest issues is that there is no, there's very little funding for it. And that's where, that's where one of the rubber meets the road issues are. The second is that the state has issued their guidance memo, and that's it. What we have is they encourage you to think about it, and they want you to do the right thing if you think you can do it, and good luck with that. So
right, and this is also something that can be the subject of ongoing due process or mediation with regard to whether or not it was necessary. It's not entirely within the school district's discretion to decide do it or not do it, but there are different ways to envision this. We did have a question come in, what if schools do not progress monitor? My answer to that would be, then you need to give me a call, because schools are not.
Yeah, I was going to say, if schools are progress monitoring, they do so at their own risk, because progress monitoring is the most important, factor. I mean, you can't make decisions without data. You need to have data to determine whether students are progressing. You need data to inform whether you need to adjust your service and support. And you need to make sure that you've considered what students' needs are in order to address them most effectively. If you don't have data, then you will spend a lot of time, looking at potential for litigation, comp ed, and other services where you might have actually done what you needed to do. But without the data, if you can't show it, then it's not, meaningful. So to me, data is the first and foremost job of districts. And again, there are different ways to collect data. There are lots of components that go into it. It's not always like a chart or a graph, but there needs to be ongoing assessment in some form or manner to determine whether a student is progressing. All right, I know we have covered the world. I imagine that we have other, things. It is just at the end, but I wanted to open up for any other questions if they have not come in. If you would like to pose a question, don't forget, you'd have to unmute yourself to pose it, or you can certainly send it in the chat box.
Tara, what were the 4 Regents exams that you said were going to be given this year? There was only 4. What were they again?
Algebra 1, English Language Arts, Living Environment. Red. I knew I was going to forget it. I'll pull it right up. Regents.
Earth science.
It's living environment is Earth science, but it was, which one is it? Sorry, just got to find the right one.
That's okay.
Okay, here we go. Algebra 1, Earth science, English language arts, and living environment. You're right, it was Earth science. See, I'm sorry. Earth science written tests only. Those are the 4 that are being offered.
Thank you.
And my understanding is those 4, because those are the 4 that the U.S. Department of Education said were mandated.
They tie to our reporting on ESSA. Yes. Other questions?
What can a parent do if they disagree with how a school is progress monitoring? The student has a 504 and is dyslexic. Mediation? I would answer that by saying that due process is always a parent's right.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of how progress is monitored or how data is collected, that is something that, the district or the committee will, determine. You can certainly ask and discuss. I don't think a parent has the right to dictate a specific approach, but I think that there should be agreement on the areas of data that is needed, that, if we're talking about progress monitoring, and I'll just, give the example of a student with a reading disability or a learning disability in the area of reading, it's going to depend on where the challenges are. Is it in their phonics and phonemic awareness? Is it their comprehension? Is it their fluency? Is it their, knowledge and understanding of vocabulary? Whichever those areas are, that may need to be what is monitored in terms of development and growth. If it's a 504 plan, there isn't a per se, IEP reporting monitoring goal, but there should be some information that is, available and discussed. I would say I could give a whole different discussion,
Right.
but on
Right, and
504.
I would answer this parent by saying, we're being asked to cut this off, Tara, but I would say to this parent that I understand what you're saying, that we have seen school districts for whom progress monitoring was simply putting a check in front of a box saying, yeah, we tried, and the student didn't engage or whatever, moved on, right? So we hear what you're saying, and there are ways to address that. But right now I'm understanding, Tara, that we need to end because there's another session that's beginning.
All right, well, thank you all so much. I hope you enjoyed. I appreciate you being here, and I know there are lots of wonderful programs to come, so go forth and learn, my friends.
Thank you.